February 13th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The tropical heat pressed down like a weight as First Lieutenant William P. Marontate climbed into the cockpit of his F4U Corsair. The temperature hovered near 32 degrees Celsius. Sweat soaked through his flight suit before he'd even started the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. Around him, 11 other Corsairs from Marine Fighting Squadron 124 prepared for their first combat mission. The bent-wing fighters sat on the coral runway, their dark blue paint already dust-covered, their distinctive inverted gull wings casting sharp shadows in the morning sun. Marontate had trained for months on the Corsair. He knew its reputation. Carrier pilots called it the Ensign Eliminator because its long nose made landing nearly impossible. The Navy had rejected it for carrier operations, so the Marines got it instead. And now, just 24 hours after arriving at Guadalcanal, VMF 124 was about to find out if this troubled aircraft could actually fight. The mission seemed straightforward. Escort a rescue Catalina flying boat to pick up downed pilots at Sandfly Bay, Vela La Vela, 350 kilometers there and back. Standard escort work. But Marontate felt the weight of the 6 Browning machine guns mounted in his wings. 3 per side, 50 caliber, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. More firepower than any fighter he'd ever flown. The armament alone weighed over 500 kilograms. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, the combined rate approached 4,800 rounds per minute, nearly 80 rounds per second. A 2-second burst put 160 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into a target. The engineering was brutal and simple. Overwhelming firepower married to a 2,000-horsepower engine. Speed, climb, and guns. The American answer to Japanese agility. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission went smoothly. The Catalina recovered the pilots. The Corsairs returned without incident. But the next day, February 14th, would be different. 9 PB 4Y1 Liberator bombers prepared to strike Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. 12 Corsairs from VMF 124 would escort them, along with 10 P-38 Lightnings. The combined formation departed Henderson Field at 0800 hours. They climbed to 20,000 feet, heading northwest. The Liberators droned ahead, slow and heavy. The fighters weaved above and behind, maintaining position. The flight lasted nearly 2 hours. Over Bougainville, they found their target. And waiting for them, climbing from below, were 42 Japanese A6M0 fighters. What followed became known in Marine Corps history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, but not for the reasons the name suggests. The Japanese interceptors rose through the bomber formation, with practiced precision. The Zeros turned inside the American fighters with ease. Their pilots, veterans of campaigns from China to the Philippines to Guadalcanal, knew every advantage their aircraft possessed. At lower speeds, the Zero could outturn anything in the sky. First Lieutenant Gordon Lee Lyon Jr. dove his Corsair into a climbing Zero. He opened fire. The Zero exploded in flames, but in the chaos of the dogfight, Lyon's wingman lost sight of him. When the survivors returned to Henderson Field 2 hours later, Lyon was missing. So was another Corsair pilot. 8 total American aircraft were destroyed, including those 2 Corsairs. The pilot, Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Yoshio Yoshida, had collided with Lyon's Corsair during the engagement. Both men died. The after-action reports were sobering. American pilots claimed 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The actual number was 1. The Japanese claimed 17 fighters and 5 bombers. The actual losses were 8 fighters and 1 bomber. Everyone overclaimed. But the fundamental truth was undeniable. The Corsair's first major engagement had been a disaster. The bent-wing bird that the Navy had rejected, that Marines had reluctantly accepted, had just lost 2 aircraft without achieving meaningful results. And across the channel in Rabaul, Japanese commanders received the intelligence reports with satisfaction. The Americans had deployed a new fighter. It was fast, heavily armed, but apparently no more effective than the Wildcats and P-42s they'd been defeating for over a year. Commander Takeo Shibata, intelligence officer for the Japanese Naval Air Force at Rabaul, reviewed the combat reports. The new American fighter, designated F4U, showed high speed in level flight and diving attacks, but it turned poorly. Its pilots seemed inexperienced. Most critically, it appeared vulnerable to the standard zero tactics that had proven successful since December 1941. Climb above, dive through, break away. The Zero's superior maneuverability at low speeds remained decisive. Shibata's conclusion appeared in multiple Japanese command briefings. The F4U represented no fundamental threat. It was another American attempt to compensate for pilot skill with engine power and heavy armament. Impressive on paper, manageable in practice. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but in February 1943, the evidence supported Japanese confidence. They controlled the skies from Rabaul. Their pilots were experienced. Their Zero fighters had dominated Pacific combat for over a year. One more American fighter type would not change the strategic balance. What the Japanese did not understand, what they could not see from combat reports and wreckage analysis, was that the Corsair represented something more fundamental than a new weapons system. It embodied a completely different philosophy of air combat. A philosophy built not on individual pilot skill or aircraft agility, but on systematic advantage, overwhelming firepower, and industrial replacement. The Americans were not trying to build a better dogfighter. They were trying to build a weapon system that made dogfighting obsolete. The story of this transformation begins not at Henderson Field in February 1943, but 3 years earlier, in the design offices of Chance Vought Aircraft Corporation in Stratford, Connecticut. February 1940. Chief designer Rex Beisel faced an impossible specification from the United States Navy. The requirement document demanded a single-engine fighter capable of at least 400 miles per hour in level flight. That speed exceeded anything then operational in the world. The British Spitfire topped out at 360 miles per hour. The German Bf 109 reached 350. The Japanese Navy's newest fighter, not yet encountered in combat, could manage 330. 400 miles per hour required unprecedented power. Beisel selected the largest radial engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, 2,000 horsepower. The engine alone weighed over 1,000 kilograms. To accommodate the massive 13-foot diameter propeller needed to absorb that power, Beisel designed an inverted gull wing. The wing center section angled sharply downward from the fuselage, then bent upward to the wingtips. This configuration kept the landing gear short while maintaining propeller ground clearance. The design was unconventional, distinctive, unmistakable, but it worked. The first XF4U-1 prototype flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard pushed the aircraft to 405 miles per hour in level flight, the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. The Navy ordered production immediately, but Beisel's design philosophy extended beyond pure performance. He specified 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing panel, outboard of the wing fold. Standard American fighters carried 4 guns. Some carried 6, but typically with less ammunition. The Corsair carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. The Browning AN M2 aircraft machine gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute. 6 guns generated a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute. That firepower density meant a 2-second burst delivered 160 rounds. Each 50-caliber projectile weighed 43 grams. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate 13 millimeters of steel at 500 meters. They could ignite fuel tanks. They could destroy engine blocks. They could cut through airframe structures. This was not precision shooting. This was area saturation. Point the nose, press the trigger, overwhelm the target with volume. where Japanese designers had optimized for pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. American designers optimized for pilot survival and target destruction. The difference was philosophical. Japanese doctrine emphasized the warrior, American doctrine emphasized the weapon system. By July 1942, the first production F4U Corsairs rolled off the Vought assembly line. By December, VMF 124 began receiving aircraft for training, but the Corsair had problems, serious problems. The long nose blocked forward visibility during landing approach. Pilots couldn't see the carrier deck until the final seconds. The powerful engine generated torque that twisted the aircraft during takeoff and landing. The stall characteristics were unpredictable. The left wing tended to drop without warning. At the Navy's carrier qualification trials in September 1942, the Corsair failed, too dangerous for carrier operations. The decision devastated Vought engineers. The aircraft they'd designed specifically for carrier operations couldn't operate from carriers. But the Marine Corps needed fighters desperately, and Marine squadrons operated from land bases. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, fighter strips in the Russell Islands, forward operating bases throughout the Solomons. The Corsair's carrier deficiencies didn't matter if it never landed on a carrier, so the Navy gave the Corsair to the Marines, and in February 1943, VMF 124 brought it to combat. That first engagement over Bougainville on February 14th seemed to confirm every criticism. 2 aircraft lost, minimal results. The Corsair appeared to be another American failure. The Marine pilots filed detailed after-action reports. They noted the Zero's superior turning ability. They described how Japanese pilots could reverse inside the Corsair's turning radius, gaining position for deflection shots. They documented the difficulty of maintaining formation during high-speed combat. The reports reached Major General Ralph Mitchell, commander of Marine Aircraft Wings Pacific. Mitchell had seen this pattern before: new aircraft, inexperienced tactics, predictable losses. The solution wasn't different aircraft. The solution was different doctrine. The Corsair couldn't outturn the Zero. Fine, don't try. The Corsair was faster than the Zero. Use that. The Corsair could outdive the Zero. Use that. The Corsair was more heavily armed and armoured than the Zero. Use that. Mitchell's staff drafted new tactical guidance. Never dogfight. Never slow down. Never try to match Japanese maneuverability. Instead, maintain altitude advantage. Dive through enemy formations. Fire short, concentrated bursts. Extend away at high speed. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. The tactics emphasized team coordination over individual combat. 2 Corsair sections would work together. One section would bait Japanese fighters into turning engagements. The other section would dive from above, attacking while the Zeros maneuvered. It was methodical, scientific, impersonal. Everything traditional fighter combat was not. And many Marine pilots resisted it initially. They'd grown up on stories of World War I aces, circling dogfights, individual duels, the romance of aerial combat. Mitchell's doctrine stripped away that romance. It demanded discipline over instinct, system over skill. But it worked. By March 1943, after 2 months of refined tactics and additional training, Corsair squadrons began achieving positive kill ratios. VMF 124 claimed 5 Japanese aircraft on April 1st with no losses. VMF 213, the second Corsair squadron to reach combat, shot down 8 Zeros on April 7th for the loss of 1 Corsair. The aircraft hadn't changed. The pilots had barely changed. The tactics had changed everything, and Japanese commanders were beginning to notice, but they still didn't understand what they were facing. From their perspective, American fighter performance was improving, but this was expected. New pilots gained experience. Losses generated learned lessons. It was the natural progression of warfare. What they failed to recognize was that American doctrine had fundamentally shifted. The United States was no longer trying to defeat Japanese fighters in individual combat. They were trying to create conditions where individual combat never occurred. Speed, altitude, firepower, position, these became the decisive factors, not turning radius, not pilot skill, not aircraft agility. The Corsair was designed around this philosophy from the beginning. 2,000 horsepower, 400 miles per hour, 6 guns, 2,400 rounds, armor plate behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero and still bring its pilot home. And when the Americans lost a Corsair, they built another, and another, and another. Vaught's Stratford plant, Goodyear's Akron plant, Brewster's Philadelphia plant, 3 companies, multiple production lines. By mid-1943, Corsairs were rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 300 per month. Japan's entire fighter production across all types was approximately 500 per month, and their production was decreasing as the war consumed resources and destroyed factories. American production was increasing. In August 1943, a new Marine squadron deployed to the South Pacific, VMF 214. On paper, it was a reconstituted unit. The original VMF 214 had completed their combat tour and returned stateside for rest and reassignment. But Major Gregory Boyington, a former Flying Tigers pilot with 6 victories in China, convinced his superiors to let him rebuild the squadron with a hand-picked group of pilots. Most were replacements from other units. Some were considered difficult. Some had disciplinary issues. Boyington didn't care about their records. He cared about their willingness to fly his way. Aggressive, fast, unrelenting. They called themselves the Black Sheep, 27 pilots, 27 Corsairs, deployed to Munda on New Georgia Island in September 1943. From there, they could reach Japanese bases throughout the Northern Solomons, and they could reach Rabaul. That changed everything. Rabaul sat at the northern tip of New Britain Island, 640 kilometers northwest of Guadalcanal. The Japanese had captured it from Australian forces in January 1942. By mid-1943, it had become their primary fortress in the South Pacific. 5 airfields ringed Simpson Harbour, Lakunai and Vunakanau, pre-war Australian strips, Rapopo, completed in December 1942 with concrete runways. Tobera, finished in August 1943, and Keravat on the north coast. Combined, these airfields had capacity for over 400 aircraft. 367 anti-aircraft guns defended the approaches. The harbour itself could accommodate dozens of ships. Submarines operated from underground pens carved into the volcanic rock, storage facilities, repair shops, barracks for over 100,000 troops. Rabaul was more than a base. It was a fortress city. The Japanese called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. For 19 months, it had been effectively untouchable. Allied bombers from Port Moresby, 500 miles distant, could barely reach it. When they did, Japanese fighters rose to meet them. Zeros dominated those engagements. But in September 1943, American forces captured Vella La Vella in the Central Solomons. Marine engineers carved an airstrip from jungle. Suddenly, Rabaul was within range. Not bomber range, fighter range. For the first time in the war, American single-engine fighters could reach the Japanese stronghold, fight over the target, and return with fuel reserves. The strategic equation had fundamentally changed, and the Marines were ready to exploit it. September 16, 1943, VMF 214's third mission. 24 Marine Corsairs escorted Navy dive bombers to Balali Island at the southern tip of Bougainville. The formation climbed to 24,000 feet. Japanese radar detected them 70 miles out. Zeros scrambled from Kahili Airfield. 50 enemy fighters rose to intercept. Boyington led the Black Sheep into the formation. The Japanese pilots attempted their standard tactics: climb above, then dive through with superior turning ability. But the Corsairs didn't turn. Boyington's section dove straight through the Zero formation at over 400 miles per hour, too fast for the Zeros to track. As they extended away, the second section dove from above, catching the Zeros while they were still turning to pursue. First Lieutenant Robert McClurg found a Zero in his gun sight at 300 yards. He pressed the trigger. All 6 guns fired simultaneously. The combined muzzle flash lit up his cockpit. The Zero disintegrated, not caught fire, not went down, smoking, disintegrated. Pieces of wings, fuselage, engine cowling scattered across the sky. The engagement lasted 11 minutes, 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed, no American losses. The mission established VMF-214's reputation, but more importantly, it validated the tactical doctrine. Speed and firepower defeated maneuverability, system defeated skill. The pattern repeated throughout September and October. Corsair squadrons flew increasingly aggressive missions into Japanese-controlled airspace. The losses flipped. By October 1943, American fighters were achieving kill ratios of 6-1, sometimes 10-1 against Japanese aircraft. And then, on December 17th, the first American fighter swept directly over Rabaul itself. Boyington led 48 Marine Corsairs from Torokina Airfield on Bougainville. They crossed the 130 miles of open water over St. George's Channel. At 0900 hours, they arrived over Simpson Harbour at 20,000 feet. Below them, Japanese shipping filled the harbour. Around them, the volcanic peaks of New Britain rose through tropical clouds. And climbing to meet them, 60 Japanese fighters, Zeros, the latest models, piloted by veterans. This was supposed to be a massacre, Japanese defensive fighters operating over their own base, against American attackers at the extreme limit of their combat radius. Every advantage favoured the defenders, except one. The Corsairs had more firepower than the Japanese had ever encountered from single-engine fighters. The engagement developed exactly as American doctrine prescribed. The Corsairs maintained altitude. When Zeros climbed to engage, the Marines dove through at high speed, 6 50-caliber guns per aircraft, 48 aircraft, 288 guns total. When multiple Corsairs targeted a single Zero, that Zero simply ceased to exist. The volume of fire was unprecedented. A Zero attempting evasive maneuvers faced not individual aimed shots, but walls of tracers. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks. The aircraft's legendary lack of armor, the design choice that gave it superior range and maneuverability, now meant instant death. One 2-second burst from a single Corsair was often sufficient. 50 rounds, 2,100 grams of projectiles, travelling at 2,800 feet per second. The kinetic energy was devastating. Boyington himself shot down 4 Zeros that morning. His wingman got 3. Across the formation, Corsair pilots methodically destroyed Japanese fighters. When fuel ran low after 90 minutes over target, the Marines turned south. They landed at Torokina with minimal damage. Behind them, 30 Japanese fighters burned in the jungle or floated in Simpson Harbour. Japanese commanders were stunned. Rabaul had never been penetrated like this. Never. The fortress that had stood impregnable for 19 months had just been violated by American, carrier-rejected fighters operating from a coral strip on a barely secured island. Commander Shibata's intelligence assessment changed overnight. The F4U was not just another American fighter, it represented a fundamental threat. The after-action analysis revealed the truth. The Corsair's 650 caliber guns, firing simultaneously, delivered approximately 4,800 rounds per minute combined. That translated to 80 rounds per second, 240 rounds in a 3-second burst. Each gun carried 400 rounds. At full trigger, a Corsair could sustain fire for approximately 30 seconds before ammunition exhaustion. But no pilot fired continuously. Controlled bursts, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, maximum efficiency. And even with that discipline, the firepower overwhelmed Japanese aircraft. The Zero, designed for agility, had no answer to volume fire. You cannot outmaneuver 80 projectiles per second. You cannot evade what you cannot predict. The mathematics were simple and brutal. More guns, more ammunition, more destructive capacity per aircraft, multiplied by formation tactics that maximized concentrated fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The raids continued through December and January. VMF-214 flew mission after mission over Rabaul. Other Marine squadrons joined them. VMF-222, VMF-223, VMF-321. Corsairs became a daily presence over Simpson Harbor. The Japanese sent up interceptors. Veterans from carrier air groups. The best pilots remaining in the Navy Air Service, they died anyway. On December 23rd, Boyington led another sweep. His score stood at 24 victories, just 2 short of Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. On December 27th, he shot down number 25. The engagement occurred at 12,000 feet over Rabaul. Boyington dove on a 0, making a climbing turn. He opened fire at 400 yards, closed to 200. The 0 exploded. Pieces of the aircraft tumbled past his canopy. He claimed another kill minutes later, but that one wasn't confirmed by witnesses. Still, 25 official victories, 1 short of the record. On January 3rd, 1944, Boyington led 70 Corsairs on a massive sweep over Rabaul. He engaged a 0 at high altitude, 2-second burst. The 0 caught fire, his 26th victory, tying Rickenbacker's record. But in the chaos of the engagement, Boyington's Corsair was hit by return fire. He ditched in St. George's Channel. His wingman, Captain George Ashman, went down nearby. Both men survived the crash. A Japanese submarine recovered them. Boyington spent the next 20 months as a prisoner of war. He survived, Ashman did not. The Black Sheep Squadron completed their second combat tour 3 days later. In 84 days of combat operations, they had shot down 94 Japanese aircraft. They had destroyed another 97 on the ground. 8 pilots became aces. The squadron's kill ratio was 11-1, but the numbers only told part of the story. The real story was what happened to Japanese air power at Rabaul. Between December 17, 1943, and February 19, 1944, American fighters flew continuous raids against the fortress. The intensity was unprecedented. Daily strikes, sometimes multiple missions per day, Marine Corsairs, Navy Hellcats, Army P-38 Lightnings. But the Corsairs bore the brunt of the fighter sweeps. Their firepower, their speed, their systematic tactics devastated Japanese air groups. Japanese records documented the losses. From November 1943 through March 1944, approximately 359 Japanese aircraft were destroyed defending Rabaul. That number included fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft. It included veterans with hundreds of combat hours and rookies with barely 50. It included aircraft from frontline carrier air groups rushed to Rabaul to reinforce the defense. Those carrier groups, the elite units of the combined fleet, lost 50% of their fighters, 85% of their dive bombers, 90% of their torpedo bombers. In 10 weeks of combat over Rabaul, the Japanese Navy lost the equivalent of their entire carrier air capability, not to American carriers. To land-based fighters operating from forward strips, the strategic implications were catastrophic. When American forces struck the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, Japanese carrier aircraft couldn't effectively oppose them. They'd been destroyed at Rabaul. When American forces invaded the Marshall Islands in January 1944, Japanese naval aviation could barely respond. The pilots were dead. The aircraft were gone. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a Zero pilot who survived the Siding Baker Rabaul campaign, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We understood that American production exceeded ours. We understood their pilots were becoming more experienced. What we did not understand until Rabaul was that they had fundamentally changed how fighter aircraft fought. The Corsair did not try to be a better Zero. It tried to make the Zero irrelevant, and it succeeded." But perhaps the most telling assessment came from Japan's greatest surviving ace. Saburo Sakai, credited with at least 28 victories, wrote in his autobiography Samurai that the Corsair was the most feared of all Allied aircraft. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, the most feared. Because Japanese pilots understood what facing a Corsair meant. If it caught you, you died. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition would ignite your fuel tanks. The volume of fire would shred your airframe. The speed differential meant you couldn't escape. Your only chance was to avoid engagement entirely. That was the ultimate irony. The Zero, designed as the ultimate dogfighter, now survived only by refusing to fight. By February 1944, Japanese commanders at Rabaul issued new instructions to surviving fighter pilots. Do not engage Corsairs in combat unless absolutely necessary. Avoid head-on passes. Avoid diving attacks. Maintain altitude advantage if possible, but do not dive through American formations. The instructions contradicted everything Japanese fighter doctrine but necessity overrode doctrine. The alternative was death. On February 19, 1944, the final major air battle over Rabaul occurred. American fighters found minimal opposition. Most Japanese aircraft had been withdrawn. The survivors pulled back to Truk, then to the Philippines. Rabaul, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was neutralized, not captured, not destroyed, neutralized. 100,000 Japanese troops remained garrisoned there. The airfield still functioned. The harbour could still accommodate shipping. But it no longer mattered strategically. Allied fighters controlled the airspace. Allied bombers cratered the runways at will. The fortress had become a prison, and the Corsair had been the primary weapon of that transformation. By war's end, United States production of F4U Corsairs exceeded 12,000 aircraft. Vought built 4,700. Goodyear built 4,100. Brewster built 735. The squadrons flew 64,000 combat sorties. They claimed 2,140 aerial victories against 189 losses, an 11-to-1 kill ratio, the lowest loss rate of any fighter in the Pacific War. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was 12-to-1. Against Japan's later, more advanced fighters like the Kawanishi N, 1KJ, George, the ratio was 6-to-1, still overwhelming. The Corsair dropped 15,621 tons of bombs, 70% of all bombs dropped by American fighters in the Pacific. It destroyed countless ground targets, ships, airfields, supply depots, infantry positions. The bent-wing bird that the Navy had rejected became the most effective multi-role fighter of the Pacific War, and it achieved that success not through superiority in traditional fighter characteristics, but through a fundamental reimagining of what fighter combat should be. The captured Japanese intelligence documents told a story that American analysts initially dismissed as propaganda. Reports from surviving Zero pilots describing their encounters with Corsairs. The language was consistent across dozens of accounts. Overwhelming firepower, impossible to evade. Our maneuverability meant nothing. Technical Sergeant Harold Fukuda, a Japanese-American translator working for Marine Intelligence, compiled these reports in March 1944. His analysis noted a pattern. Japanese pilots weren't complaining about American skill. They weren't attributing losses to better tactics, though those certainly existed. They were describing a fundamental mismatch in weapons philosophy. One report, from a pilot identified only as Flight Warrant Officer Hayashi, stationed at Rabaul in January 1944, was particularly stark. We were taught that air combat is decided by pilot skill and aircraft performance. The Americans have proven this wrong. Their Corsairs do not need superior performance in turning. They do not engage us on our terms. Instead, They impose their terms through speed and firepower. When 6 machine guns concentrate on your aircraft for 2 seconds, no amount of skill saves you. No evasive maneuver works. You simply die. This was not the complaint of a defeated warrior. It was the observation of a professional, recognizing that the rules had changed. The Japanese had built an air force around individual excellence. The Americans had built an air force around systematic advantage. Both approaches worked, but only one scaled. Only one could sustain losses and continue fighting. Only one could be taught to replacement pilots in months rather than years. The Zero required 18 months to train a fully qualified combat pilot. The Corsair required 6 months of flight school plus 2 months of tactical training. The difference wasn't in aircraft difficulty. Both were challenging to fly. The difference was in combat philosophy. A Zero pilot needed to master aerobatic maneuvering, deflection shooting, energy management in turning fights, skills that required hundreds of hours to develop. A Corsair pilot needed to master formation flying, diving attacks, gunnery at high speed, skills that could be systematically taught and reinforced. When Japan lost experienced pilots, they lost years of accumulated expertise. When America lost experienced pilots, they lost men. Tragic, grievous, but replaceable. The industrial equation reinforced this asymmetry. By 1944, the United States was producing fighters at 10 times Japan's rate. Pilot training throughput exceeded Japan's by even wider margins, and the aircraft themselves embodied different values. Consider the weight breakdown. An F4U Corsair weighed 4,175 kilograms empty. An A6M50 weighed 1,876 kilograms. The Corsair was more than twice as heavy, but that weight wasn't dead mass. It was armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, stronger airframe structures, more powerful engine, heavier armament. Each kilogram served pilot survival and mission effectiveness. The Zero's lightness bought range and agility, but it bought them at the cost of protection. A Zero pilot flying over Rabaul in January 1944 knew that a single burst from a Corsair meant death. Not probable death, certain death. The psychological impact was devastating. Warrant Officer Kuniyoshi Tanaka, shot down over Rabaul on January 27, 1944, and recovered by Japanese naval forces, described the experience. "I saw 3 Corsairs diving toward our formation. I thought I could evade. I'd evaded American fighters before, P-40 seconds, Wildcats. But these were different. The volume of fire was impossible. I rolled left, tracers followed. I reversed right, more tracers. I pushed the nose down. The tracers converged. My wing exploded. I don't remember ejecting. I woke up in the water with my aircraft burning around me." Tanaka survived. Most didn't. The kill ratio told the story, but the ratio only measured aircraft destroyed. It didn't measure missions aborted because Japanese fighters refused engagement. It didn't measure the psychological toll of flying against an opponent whose firepower made survival random. By March 1944, Japanese fighter units at Rabaul had been withdrawn. The remaining pilots were reassigned to homeland defense. New pilots, with minimal training, arrived to replace them. These replacements lasted for days, sometimes hours. First Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215, flying Corsairs over Rabaul in January 1944, noted the change. "The quality of Japanese pilots has declined dramatically. We're seeing aircraft that fly in straight lines, that don't attempt evasive maneuvers. I shot down 3 in one mission, and none of them tried to escape. They just kept flying straight while I closed from behind. It felt wrong, like target practice, not combat." Hansen accumulated 25 victories in 17 days of combat. He died on February 3, 1944, when his Corsair was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Rabaul. He was 23 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His brief, intense combat career illustrated both the effectiveness of Corsair tactics and the unforgiving nature of Pacific air combat. But his observations about Japanese pilot quality were accurate. Japan's training pipeline had collapsed under attrition. The experienced pilots who had opened the war, men with thousands of flight hours, were dead, killed over Rabaul, over the Solomons, over New Guinea. Their replacements had 50 to 100 flight hours, barely enough to take off and land safely. Against Corsairs flown by Marines with 200 to 300 hours, these rookies stood no chance. The mathematics were simple: superior aircraft, superior firepower, superior tactics, superior training infrastructure, superior industrial capacity. Japan had none of these advantages by mid-1944. What they had was courage, discipline, a willingness to die for the emperor. These were not trivial qualities, but they were insufficient against a war machine built on systematic advantage. The American way of war didn't ask for individual sacrifice. It asked for professional competence in a system designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk. The Corsair embodied this philosophy. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing tanks prevented fires. The massive engine could absorb battle damage and continue running. Multiple hydraulic systems provided redundancy. The airframe could sustain combat damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Corsairs returned from missions with dozens of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, failed systems. They landed safely. The pilots walked away. The aircraft were repaired and flew again. This was unthinkable in Japanese doctrine. Aircraft were expendable. Pilots were expendable. The mission was everything. The Corsair said the pilot was valuable, worth protecting, worth bringing home. That philosophical difference defined the Pacific Air War's outcome. By August 1945, the Japanese Navy had virtually no combat-capable carrier aircraft remaining. The Army Air Force was reduced to kamikaze attacks because conventional combat was no longer viable. The pilots who might have challenged American air superiority were dead, killed at Rabaul, killed over the Philippines, killed defending the homeland. Meanwhile, American fighter strength continued growing. Corsairs, Hellcats, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of trained pilots, an industrial and training capacity that Japan could never match. The bent-wing bird that Japanese commanders had laughed at in February 1943 had become the symbol of their aerial defeat. Not because it was the best fighter aircraft ever built, not because it was invincible, but because it represented a system that worked, a philosophy of war that valued the warrior enough to protect him. That trusted in firepower over finesse. That understood air combat was won through systematic advantage, not individual duels. The final statistics were comprehensive. From February 1943 through August 1945, Corsair squadrons flew 64,051 operational sorties. They claimed 2,140 air combat victories. They lost 189 aircraft to enemy fighters. The overall kill ratio exceeded 11 to 1, but these numbers obscure the human cost. 189 Corsairs lost to Japanese aircraft meant approximately 150 American pilots killed or captured. Each one a trained professional, each one mourned by family and squadron mates, each one a life ended in violent combat. The Japanese losses were proportionally worse. 2,140 aircraft destroyed meant approximately 2,000 Japanese pilots killed. Most of them burned alive when 50 caliber incendiary rounds ignited their unprotected fuel tanks. Some survived to be captured. Most didn't. The Pacific offered few opportunities for successful bailouts. The ocean swallowed the wreckage and the dead without distinction. Among those dead were some of Japan's finest aviators. Men who had opened the war with attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, who had dominated early Pacific combat, who had believed in their aircraft and their training. They died because their commanders had built an air force optimized for one kind of war, and the Americans fought a different kind. This single aircraft, the F4U Corsair, provided irrefutable evidence of the fatal miscalculation. Japanese commanders who laughed at early combat reports in February 1943 were silent by February 1944. The bent-wing bird they'd dismissed had systematically destroyed Japanese air power throughout the South Pacific, had neutralized Rabaul, had achieved kill ratios that made conventional air combat suicidal for Japanese pilots, had proven that firepower and systematic tactics defeated individual skill and aircraft agility. The lesson transcended aviation. It spoke to fundamental approaches to warfare. The Japanese built a military around warrior ethos, individual excellence, spiritual strength, acceptance of death. The Americans built a military around industrial capacity, systematic training, technological advantage, protection of personnel. Both systems produced brave men willing to fight and die, but only one system was designed to win a long war of attrition. The Corsair story is not just about aircraft. It's about what nations value, what they're willing to sacrifice, what they're willing to protect. The Japanese valued the mission above the man, the aircraft as expendable as the pilot, range and agility over armor and survivability. The Americans valued different things. They built aircraft to bring pilots home. They designed tactics to minimize losses while maximizing effectiveness. They created training systems that could replace casualties. They harnessed industrial capacity to overwhelm opponents through sheer material advantage. History rendered its verdict in the wreckage of Japanese air power, in the neutralized fortress of Rabaul, in the kill ratios that averaged 11-1, in the survival of American pilots who walked away from damaged aircraft, in the deaths of Japanese pilots who had no such option. By war's end, the commanders who had laughed at the Corsair in 1943 were either dead or facing defeat. The aircraft they'd dismissed as another American failure had become the most effective fighter bomber in the Pacific, and the Marines who flew it had proven that systematic advantage, properly exploited, defeats individual excellence every time. The bent-wing bird flew on. Corsairs served in the Korean War. They flew ground support missions until 1953. Some remained in service with foreign air forces into the 1960s. The last combat mission was flown in 1969 by the Honduran Air Force, 26 years after that disastrous first engagement over Bougainville. A quarter-century of proving that the Japanese commanders who laughed were catastrophically wrong, and that the Americans who trusted in firepower, armor, and systematic tactics had understood the future of air combat better than anyone realized in February 1943. When Japanese engineers examined captured Corsairs after the war, they found the same things that Corsair pilots had known all along: thick armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, robust structure, 6 heavy machine guns. The aircraft weighed twice what a Zero weighed. But every kilogram served a purpose: protection, firepower, survivability, the philosophy written in aluminum and steel. Value the pilot, bring him home, let him fight again tomorrow. That philosophy won the air war over the Pacific. Not the best aircraft, not the bravest pilots. The philosophy that understood modern war required sustainable systems, not individual heroes. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.